Monday, and tomorrow we have another meeting here, a genealogical related meeting. You'll see the brochures out back. All of the brochures any of us are talking about will be out back, and if you didn't pick them up before, you can pick them up on your way out. Tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock, it's not a 6 o'clock gig, it's a 4 o'clock gig. Barbara Matthews will be here. She's our last lecturer in the Intermediate Genealogy Lecture Series, the theme of which has been the American Revolutionary War. So I hope you can join us for that. Up back are also the fall brochures from our local family history series, lecture series. There are 2 more left in the fall series, and next to those is the flyer for the spring setup, which starts in January and runs until May. So we hope you'll pick those up. Now Sharon, who's reappeared, will tell you a little bit about Mass Genealogical Council.
Okay. I'll just make this quick. We have sign-up sheets at the back of the room, one to receive the newsletter, and then there's another one. We'd like you to leave your contact information if you'd like to be on our mailing list and hear about upcoming events. We also have a flyer for the next workshop, which is December 5, and it is it's going to be about how to work through the process of tracking legislation and being successful in promoting legislation that favors your interests. And MassGen has a seminar in 2016 in April, and there's a flyer for that as well. It's 2 days, and you may be interested in the all-day session on Europe about genetic genealogy. And a membership brochure, if you're interested in that. And we thank you for coming.
Thanks, Sharon. And welcome everyone to the Boston Public Library on behalf of the Massachusetts Genealogical Council and the Social Sciences and Government Information Department of the BPL. My name is Linda McIver. I'm from Social Sciences. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Sharon Sargent, forensic genealogist and vice president of Mass Genealogical Council, who developed and will moderate this timely presentation on access to public records. Welcome back, Sharon.
I'd like to say a little bit more about the Massachusetts Genealogical Council in that the council is 35 years old and was created for 2 types of missions. One was to monitor legislative activity that affected records access and preservation, and the other is to provide educational seminars, and that is what has been done for 35 years. I've been involved for about 15 years. But there are plenty of folks who've been involved longer. In any case, the Massachusetts Genealogical Council is now recognized as a 401c3, so we do accept tax-deductible contributions. We spend our money on activities to help promote the education and also awareness, because part of our educational activities has to do with what's going on in the legislature that affects records access and preservation. Our board is all volunteers and always has been. Our board is blessed with a number of people with a broad spectrum of skills, which has always been true also. So we have folks who are attorneys, accountants, teachers, clerks in government offices or managers in government offices, and a whole spectrum of people in transportation, telecommunications, and security. So we have many technical skills in, across the board, and that helps us to understand the consequences of legislation beyond specific research goals. But we also try to work with other folks that are stakeholders in the records access and preservation. So again, that's part of what we're doing this evening, is to talk about what is the value of open public records. And we want to make sure that folks who are stakeholders with open public records know about the other groups that can help them work through the issues that we have to deal with. Now, starting with our panel, we have Robert Ambrogi, who is an attorney for Massachusetts, most importantly, the executive director of the Massachusetts Newspapers Association. He's very versed in open records and open meeting issues, and we see him at the State House quite a bit. In addition, we have a statement from Leah McGrath Goodman, who's a Newsweek senior reporter and editor. Unfortunately, she was unable to get out of Dodge, which is Europe, on an assignment, so she couldn't be here tonight. But she did speak at a hearing in DC in June, and that's where we're taking excerpts from her statement, because the federal hearing raised issues that are also of the same cloth as those that we have here in Massachusetts. So it's a universal problem, at least in the United States. We will have Pat Rio, who will read Leah's statement, and she's very graciously agreed to be the talent, because she will read very well, I'm sure. Pat also has recently joined the Massachusetts Genealogical Council, and she has a background in medical records and HIPAA issues, which intersect with public records. Finally, we have Melindy Lutz Byrne, who's an author, editor, genealogist, and a number of skills across the board. She's a fellow at, she's a Cohen Fellow, and an American Society of Genealogists Fellow, a certified genealogist, but also works on forensic issues that include her skills in facial reconstruction. And as you'll find, as we talk more and more about how public records are used, it goes right across the board. And there are many cases that Melindy will bring to us. So we're going to start with Mr. Ambrogi, because he sat on the end.
I would have sat on the other end if I did.
And well, just to explain for a moment, our panel is going to make some introductory remarks and information, but we really would like to have discussion from the participants. So if you would like to ask a question or contribute something, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Thanks so much, Mr. Ambrogi.
Thank you. As Sharon said, I'm the executive director of the Massachusetts Newspaper Publishers Association, and we represent all of the newspapers in the state, primarily in the legislature and in the courts. So I'm a registered lobbyist on behalf of the Newspaper Association, and do legal work on behalf of the Newspaper Association. I'm also an attorney in private practice up on the North Shore. And for us, open government issues are really kind of our bread and butter. I've been personally in this job for a little over 10 years, and our association has existed since the early 1970s, and really our primary mission over the years has been to try and push for stronger open meeting and public records laws. We were involved in some of the original drafting of the laws that are on the books today in terms of both open meeting and public records. We consider them extremely important for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think the news media tends to see our role as keeping the public informed about the workings of government. We strongly believe that an informed electorate is essential to the democratic society, and the way it's typically worked in our country is that the news media has provided a lot of the coverage of what's going on in government, because obviously a lot of citizens have jobs to do and other things and can't make it to every meeting and can't be hanging around City Hall or the State House finding out what's going on. We also believe, as Justice Brandeis, former Supreme Court Justice from Massachusetts, said way back in the early 1900s, that sunshine is the best of disinfectants, that being able to shine a light on the workings of government is critical to keeping government open and honest and accountable. Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, that ain't always the case. I imagine a lot of you might have seen the Globe this morning with the headline, an F for the state on open records, Mass among the worst in the U.S. for public records access. This is a watchdog group out of Washington, D.C., just released a report evaluating, grading the 50 states on their public records laws, and Massachusetts was one of the worst. That wasn't news to any of us who work in this area. Well, maybe you saw, I see Jim Lamke out here, who I know has a different opinion on some of them, also a lawyer who's very active in this area, has a different opinion on some of this stuff than I do. But for those of us in the news media, this has not been news. I think over the last year in particular, there's been some really spectacular coverage of some of the public records issues in the state. The Boston Globe in particular, and Todd Wallach, a reporter there, has really been doing a phenomenal job of just showing just how dysfunctional our public records laws are. The law, not only is the law severely outdated, it's just not well enforced. The public records law that is now on the books in Massachusetts has not substantially been revised since the early 1970s. As you can imagine, a lot about how we keep records has changed since the 1970s. It's a totally different world now than it was in the 1970s, but our law has not been updated to reflect that. We also have a system that just has not been very strong in terms of enforcement. Under our law, there are two different ways you can try and enforce the law if you're denied access to a public record. One is to file a complaint with the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State can then investigate and issue a determination. If the Secretary of State finds that there has been a violation, the Secretary of State can then issue an order. If that order is not complied with, the Secretary of State has no authority on his own to take action to enforce that. The Secretary of State has to turn the case over to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office then has to reevaluate the case and make a decision on their own as to whether or not they'll bring an enforcement action in the courts. That's a cumbersome, time-consuming process. Again, Todd Wallach again had a great report on the rulings coming out of the Secretary of State's office, often either not finding violations, or just kind of giving a slap on the wrist where there are violations found. And there's been a long-standing history of a poor relationship between the Secretary of State and the Attorney General's office, such that the Attorney General's office was effectively not carrying out any enforcement actions on these cases. That has now changed with the current Attorney General. At least the current Attorney General has vowed that will change, and every indication is that she's good for her word on that. But that's one enforcement mechanism. The other one is to bring a lawsuit. Citizens can go to court and bring actions to try and enforce the public records law. But under our law, there are no attorney's fees. If you bring an action, you're doing it out of your own pocket. Even if you're successful in proving that the government agency violated the law, you would have no chance of recovering your attorney's fees. Massachusetts is one of only 3 states in the country where that's so. 47 other states allow successful litigants in actions to enforce the public records law to cover their attorney's fees. If you've been paying attention at all to this issue, you probably know that there has been legislation percolating around on Beacon Hill that would really make some meaningful reforms in the law. This legislation would authorize attorney's fees. It would create a system of records access officers in state agencies, somebody who would be accountable to people who are making records requests. It would what's the big thing?
Sanctions?
No, not sanctions. The sanctions are the attorney's fees, but it would rationalize the fee structure under the law. You may have read some of the stories that have come out this year and over the past years about the outrageous fees being requested in some cases under the public records law. Probably a lot of you know this, that when you request a public record, if it's something that's there on the desk, you can go in and look at it for free. But if you want copies of records, or if it's something that needs to be pulled out of a database or something, then the fees can be charged for that. Some of the fee estimates or fee requests, or fee demands that have been given have really been outrageous. One of the requests that Todd Wallach wrote about earlier this year was a lawyer in front of me. But it was, asked for state police records on breathalyzer tests. It was a lawyer who's doing, actually serves as a kind of an expert witness testifying on breathalyzer matters, and was trying to compile data on breathalyzer tests given in the different states, and had gone to any number of different states and had requested these records, and for the most part have received them with no problem, and generally at very little cost. When he got to Massachusetts and asked for these records, he was given a bill of like $12 million in order to get these records. Just a truly outrageous amount of money. And the kinds of, we don't hear about that much, but we do often hear about cities and towns asking for fees in the many thousands of dollars for public records. I'm not going to sit here and say that the fee requests are always outrageous, because they're not, and they're often rational and reasonable, and probably for the most part they are. But it's these standout cases that really corrupt the law and the system and make it difficult to get records. So that bill is been percolating. It was reported out of the Joint Committee on State Administration, which is the committee that initially vets all the transparency laws in Massachusetts. It is now with the House Ways and Means Committee. Again, if you're following this at all, you may have read that there's been some fear that that bill is going to be stalled there. There has been a lot of potential, we thought, for meaningful public records reform. There's also been a lot of opposition to the bill. Organizations that represent municipalities, we just learned recently the state police have been lobbying against this bill. Others have been actively lobbying against the bill. At this point, it's a little bit hard to say what might happen with it, and we're near the end of the legislative, about to go into a legislative break soon. There is a belief that some kind of a bill is going to come out of the House, but that it may be substantially watered down. At least the fear that it's going to be substantially watered down from the bill that was originally reported out of committee. I promised to just give an overview to start, and we're going to get into more of a discussion as we go on. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the program once we start the discussion.
Thank you, Bob. And next, Pat Rio is going to read from the statement from Leah McGrath Goodman shortly after the Massachusetts legislature held the hearing on this open records law. I think it's H3665. I think that's the current number. Sometimes they change them or merge them. In any case, shortly after the May hearing here in Massachusetts, there was a federal hearing on FOIA. So the federal level, but all of the issues that were raised in Massachusetts were also raised on a national level. And Leah McGrath Goodman, journalist for Newsweek, was one of the folks who provided written and oral testimony. And Pat Rio has graciously agreed to read from that statement, since we weren't able to actually transport Leah back here in time.
Thank you. It's an honor to be able to read this. I read this testimony to you. I read it before I came, and it's very powerful. So I'll be reading excerpts from Leah McGrath Goodman, senior writer and finance editor for Newsweek. And this is from June 2nd, 2015. It's testimony to the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee on the Freedom of Information Act and the increasing lack of transparency among U.S. government agencies. And these are the excerpts. The fact that we came here represents a stark departure from our usual routine as journalists. While we may frequently be found writing about hearings such as this, we do not, as a rule, participate in them. Our mandate to remain objective as journalists demands that we stay well above the political fray and cover stories from all angles, notwithstanding whatever our privately held opinions might be. The larger problem we now face is that our role of objectively collecting and reporting the facts has been increasingly and aggressively blocked by those who would seek to separate journalists and the public from the information to which we are lawfully entitled. In my job as a senior writer and finance editor for Newsweek, I have been surprised by the number of government agencies that will stonewall even the most basic requests for information that readers and the public have a right to. Our job, which is to inform the public about issues crucial to our democracy and to the national discourse, relies on our ability to gather and check facts in a timely fashion. It should be understood that this is the job of journalists, to have no agenda other than to get answers to important questions for our readers. We aren't just answerable to the public, we are the public. The long waiting times, heavy redactions, and lack of accountability and culture of concealment that seems to pervade the FOIA process also carries over into all aspects of dealing with government agencies for journalists. Once upon a time, you could call a government agency, talk to someone with a real first and last name with contact information, tell them what you were writing about, and set up an interview with a knowledgeable human being who could discuss it with you. Sometimes they would have no comment, which is fair enough, but everyone knew who they were dealing with, and the process was about as honest and straightforward as anyone could expect it to be. In other words, there was a modicum of responsiveness and accountability. These days, when I call a federal agency, what I am dealing with can only be compared to an offshore call center with a constantly rotating cast of people answering the phones who are trained not to give their names, who can tell you nothing of who is knowledgeable on the topic about which you are researching, and 9 times out of 10 ask you to send an email to the generic info@government.gov address, which, as all journalists can attest, is the kiss of death. I don't think this is the fault of these staffers. In my opinion, most staff at these government agencies are no longer empowered by their superiors to have even the most rudimentary exchanges with journalists. One example, while investigating high-frequency trading and whether it was disrupting the nation's markets as finance editor for Newsweek last spring, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission repeatedly told me that I could not quote its market experts, even after conducting extensive interviews with them and agreeing to allow them to check their quotes for accuracy before we went to print. This is the government agency tasked with overseeing the nation's stock markets. The SEC also informed me that while I could use the information it had given me, I could not say where I had gotten it in my story. In other words, I was not to say I had received it from the SEC. I was expected to present the information to the public as incontrovertible fact and conceal that it came from the SEC. Ethically, journalists cannot agree to such terms except under rare circumstances, usually ones entailing the security or protection of an individual, not a large government agency. But these agencies want this kind of special treatment every day. In the case of the SEC story, I did not agree to the terms, and as a result, an SEC staffer asked to speak to my editor. The message here was clear. If I did not do as I was told, the situation would be escalated in a retaliatory fashion. My editor was not amused, and days after my story went to print, the SEC's chairman announced an investigation into high-frequency trading and whether it was disrupting the nation's market. To directly address what can be done regarding FOIA and the broader problems of which I speak, Congress may want to consider legislating an enforceable set of core standards by which Americans can seek and receive information in a timely fashion from identifiable sources within their government in response to questions, rather than the cloak and dagger games that now beleaguer even the most basic efforts to get at facts. Until such standards are imposed and enforced, I believe the games will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. That's a very powerful statement and not something that warms the cockles of the soul. But it's important to hear all of this. Next up is Melindy Lutz-Byrne, who's going to talk about quite a wide spectrum of applications in her experience.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this group. Before I say further, I want to defend the dishonor of my current home state, New Hampshire. It may be that Massachusetts gets an F in open records. New Hampshire is 47th out of the 50 states in returning money is cheated to the state, to its rightful owners, which I think is right up there with high crimes and misdemeanors, in my opinion. So in April, it'll be 40 years that I've been working at open records. The first 10 or so I used to learn the trade, and the next decade I spent finding missing heirs and learning that there's a big difference between private lives and public records. I've also done quite a few years of historical research. I have a specialty which is all the Africans in Boston prior to 1680, which is in great demand in speaking circles, I can imagine. I actually did a symposium for Hofstra Law School on the first habeas corpus filing, which was in the 1660s by a free African woman in Boston over a case that I call the headless baby. So there's a lot of records that you you don't usually have to go through great contests to access, that have precedents and other useful things that are long forgotten, just sitting there at the National Archives, or in this case at the Massachusetts Commonwealth Archives. I've also done work locating primary next of kin for repatriating the remains of soldiers from foreign wars. I've solved a few medical mysteries with open records, and I'm actually from Ohio, and I can remember a time when babies were not saddled with a social security number at birth, and where politicians were still saying the social security number is not a national ID number and will never be used that way. And that you had a social security number instead of a driver's license number in 30 plus states. No big deal. It wasn't a threat to you. It was your social security number. So what? Well, you also wanted people to know when your birthday was, sort of like Facebook now. But, you know, somebody might say happy birthday to you, or they might come to your party. Maybe some of you will remember in the 1990s, one of the first major databases where you could put somebody's name in and get their birth date and their street address was called allbirthdays.com. And it was all about, hey, you want to send somebody some flowers? Use FTD, and here's the date you should be sending them, and there's the person's address. No harm there either. I could also say that most people in my neighborhood knew my mother's maiden name. It was not a secret. There's nothing inherently evil in any of this information, and it was far from private. You would tell somebody in a second what your mother's maiden name was, or you know, short of being a certain age, you'd tell them when your birthday was, things like that. You didn't have to have a dump truck to carry the IRS code to where it belonged. I mean, these were good days. So my central point in everything I will be saying tonight is that the answer to problems with private and sensitive information will never be to close it, because it isn't private and it isn't closed. What you need to do is control how others use it. And frankly, our legislators are otherwise good business people have exposed us to people who will commit fraud with that information, and that's what we need to guard against.
Thank you, Melinda. Now I'd like to ask folks in the audience if you have a particular question to start further discussion with, or if you have an anecdote that you would like to share.
And if they don't have anecdotes, I have some.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a bit of a counter-narrative. We start with home addresses and telephone numbers and email addresses now. I represent the town of Lexington. The superintendent of schools took a controversial stand to defend same-sex marriage in the schools, and his email and home address and telephone number were published on some right-wing sites. He got death threats from 80 or so persons until the ATF and the FBI investigated where some of these were coming from. And that's one of the reasons why home addresses and emails and telephone numbers for employees need to be protected in this day and age. Let me also talk about the Globe coverage. It's been very one-sided. They have not talked to custodians of records, to town clerks, municipalities about it. They've talked about the abuses, which we recognize. There are abuses. There are also abuses that requesters have. Monsanto Corporation, which had thousands and thousands of pages of public records that requested it made to the town of Lexington when it was defending a PCB lawsuit poisoning kids in schools. Records that it wouldn't be entitled to in court, but used the Public Records Act to inflict pain on the town for the audacity of taking them to court. There are other kinds of requests, hundreds of thousands of email records that one disgruntled citizen asked the town of Concord, which we estimated would take one secretary a full year to review and make sure that HIPAA records, for example, were not included. Special education, which just was a Supreme Judicial Court decision that we have to both release records and redact information that threatens the privacy of those students. Why are we so outraged that 5 million emails of federal employees and social security numbers were hacked if public records should be just distributed willy-nilly upon request? There are costs, just like this public library. If somebody comes to the desk and asks for a copy of Gone with the Wind, a public librarian can do it quite easily, no charge. But if somebody says, I want all the books on the Civil War, it takes time, it takes cost. Transparency in public records access is not free, just like other public goods. And so the idea that the taxpayer should have to pay in all cases for the staff time to do these record searches, when they may be purely commercial interests. I want all the addresses of the water utility customers to market to, et cetera, et cetera. Not every request is from a public interest group, not from the ACLU, not from the media. Records requests, the custodian has no right to even ask why a request is being made. So it may not be in the public interest. It may not be something the taxpayer should be burdened by in terms of the cost of this. And just one last comment. We always hear about the Brandeis quote about sunshine. And I just want to point out, that the Benghazi hearing and the Republican debates do not, with the spotlight on them, open government, right? It changes the dynamic. I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad or good, but you get performance. You don't necessarily get good deliberation, good governance, good problem solving. So you have to look at the nuances of open government, and certainly there are some things that need to be done without the legal lights on them. The Constitution, by the way, our Constitutional Convention was under lock and key. Doors and windows were shut so that the original founders of our country could develop the trade-offs. With the egregious exception of slavery, they did a pretty good job under lock and key so that there wouldn't be that sort of performance in playing to crowds that unfortunately is often the case of government now.
What was your name, please?
My name is Kevin Bott. I'm a municipal council for several towns in the area.
Thank you, Kevin. You raised a number of issues that we're aware of the Massachusetts Genealogical Council in terms of reasonable requests, reasonable respect for the time and the other duties that clerks have to deal with at the municipal level. And that is something that we work with our constituency in genealogy on an educational level to talk about those issues. But perhaps someone else would like to talk about the legal ramifications or the legal trade-offs, because clearly you're talking about, a number of issues. I think, if I understood you correctly, Melindy, when you talked about open records, you were also talking about making sure that people aren't breaking the law or misusing, I think
was the term you used.
So in the case of somebody who's being threatened because of their views, which they expressed as a First Amendment right, the question is how do we, handle that? So I think the contact information is secondary to the first. That's my view. But would anybody else like to comment? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jim Lampke. I'm the fellow that my good friend Bobby Ambrogi referred to as perhaps having some different views. I'm an attorney. I primarily represent cities and towns. I'm also the executive director of the Massachusetts Municipal Lawyers Association, which is a bar association of local government attorneys. And I think there's probably more that we can agree on than perhaps disagree on. And so first, let me just say that people on my side of the table, local government officials, local government employees, attorneys, etc., do agree wholeheartedly that the law is outdated and it needs to be updated, needs to be made more efficient, needs to be utilizing the technologies that we believe are out there. But it's not a simple enough thing of just changing the words of the statute and all of a sudden it's going to be accomplished. The municipal side of this debate, right off at the beginning, recognized that there is a need for change and urged the legislature to create a study committee. Now, this was not a study committee where things get referred to committee on the Hill, and Bob can probably verify this. That's considered, like a DOA situation. The subject matter is dead if it gets referred to a committee. What we advocated was a broad study commission made up of all the stakeholders in this issue, the media, organizations such as the Genealogical Council that makes good use of public records, local government representatives from the Mass Municipal Association, from our association, city and town clerks who I'm convinced may not even be aware of current proposals that they are the default public records access person for their communities and how that's going to affect them. State government, local government people, they all have an interest in solving this problem of making records more readily available. But the legislature is not heading in that direction, and that's their prerogative. We favor responsible and balanced changes to the law. And I think you have to start by looking, why do custodians not release records? Why don't we just let everyone come in and go through the file cabinet, pick out what they want, make photocopies on a local copy machine at the clerk's office, and put the records back? Well, I think everyone would probably agree that that's not particularly a good way to handle important government documents. Custodians don't release records because there are specific exemptions under the law that primarily, the usual ones that come up is that they may relate to matters in litigation that are protected by attorney-client privilege. They may have privacy-related information in them, social security numbers, driver's license, medical information. Is anyone here concerned about the fact that 15 years ago, when they applied for some type of a permit from the town, they may have given their social security number to the town? Now someone comes in and says, I want to see all the applications for blank. That could have social security numbers. Now we all recognize that with new technology, computer systems may be the answer in the future, but those older documents are certainly not digitized to the degree that you can bring them up on the computer on an Excel spreadsheet and say, okay, print out this document, but delete column G that has people's social security numbers on it. Privacy of medical-related issues, family-related status, marital status. Unfortunately, we see the effects of domestic violence, other crimes against people, and sometimes in evaluating public records, you have to deal with that consideration. I hear that 47 states allow attorney's fees, and I don't doubt that to be correct. However, some of those states, you have to look at, well, what's the process by which they do allow the attorney's fees? Is it an automatic situation that if you win, you get your attorney's fees? Or what happens if you lose? Should the municipality or the governmental agency that may have spent tens of thousands of your taxpayer dollars on hiring an attorney or paying staff